So today's topic is postdoctoral fellowships, and the discussion is going to be led by Dr. Jessica Rosenberg. To my knowledge, she's done 2 postdoc fellowships, one the NSF Astronomy and Astrophysics Fellowship, and then the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. So this is going to be a really exciting talk, and I just dropped the link to the anonymous question forum. I'm going to be checking it real time during the talk, so you can either unmute and ask questions, you can type your questions in the chat, or I will also look there and bring up the questions. And then next week, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Christine Fund on the science of effective mentorship.
Great. Well, thanks, Catherine. And I actually also did a more traditional postdoc with someone, on his research. So we can talk about that path as well, sort of the standard work on somebody's grant-funded research option as well. So I think really, and I see, we have a handful of graduate students, and Michael, we've got at least one undergrad. So thinking a little bit further down the line. But regardless of where you're at, I think one of the big keys as you start to look at the next steps is really think about what it is you want to do. And for people considering postdoctoral appointments, the National Postdoc Association has a lot of really useful information. So I highly recommend having a look at what they've got and using some of their documents to think through both what you might want to apply for and what kinds of positions you might want to look for, but also how to make the best use of that time, because that's really key. So as you think about this, and especially as you're finishing your dissertation, there are a handful of options, right? You can go to industry, there are national labs, there's science policy, there's sort of the high research activity academic, right? Academic with an emphasis on teaching at the K-12 level. I mean, there are lots and lots of types of jobs you can consider down the road. And as you're finishing your dissertation, starting to get a sense of which of these directions, and it may not be that you have absolutely one that you've determined at that point, but sort of some sense of the kind of direction you want to go is really useful, because it will help shape what you apply to do next. In some cases, especially in industry, there are a lot of options just to go directly and do that. So postdocs might not always be the right answer, and that's fine as well. And there are internship options to help point you that way as well. So if that's something you're thinking about, it's definitely worth considering. Teaching at K-12, right? There are some certification needs for public schools at least. So thinking about how one prepares for that could be useful, right? So just generally thinking about this, it doesn't mean you have to go to sort of the standard academic research path, right? And I think that's one of the things we often talk about, and the traditional postdocs tend to guide you in that direction. But even within those, as we'll discuss, there are some differences and some different choices that you can make to consider. Certainly, if you're considering the academic path, which postdoc is more of a sort of step in the way towards, really thinking about what you want to do on the teaching and working with students side is really important, because there are not a handful of this sort of high research activity academic positions, and that's great. And looking at the sort of research emphasis postdocs for those is really important. But if you enjoy the teaching side, or considering positions where you can work more directly sort of with students, especially undergraduates, research projects with those undergraduates, making sure that that kind of experience is something that you can get during that postdoc if you're going to take one. And some people go directly into those positions, but many also do postdocs before they get there, is really helpful. So and then, right, science policy is a different piece of this as well. So as you get to these, right, I put at the top of here, the Postdoc's Guide to the Postdoc Timeline. This is from that National Postdoc Association website. They've got this guide, which again is really quite useful. And that you're sort of in the postdoc, getting started, laying the groundwork, moving full speed ahead, searching for a job, right? Very quickly, once you get into a postdoc, you're searching for a job and transitioning. So coming in with that, again, that's why thinking about where you want to go is really important at this stage, because you have a couple of, 1, 2, 3, usually at most, I mean, there's some exceptions, but 3 years to really prepare yourself for that next step. And right, and you apply well before you get to year 3. So you're kind of the beginning of year 2, if it's even a 3-year position and you're already applying. If it's shorter than that, it comes at you really fast. So types of postdocs, right? Especially sort of thinking about some of these more traditional, they're the national postdocs that allow you to choose a location. These are the things like the Hubble ones, which now are Sagan, Einstein, and I can't remember what the third one is. It's in a future slide. It used to just be the Hubble, and then there were some other Space Telescope ones, but now it's all sort of bunched up under the Hubble Space Telescope Fellowship, right? But there you choose where you want to take the fellowship. What I call National Lab Fellowships, and those and the prize fellowships at individual institutions, National Lab ones, right? Give you some choices as to position, but often you're applying to work at one of those labs. And in some sense, that fits along the same lines as these prize fellowships at individual institutions. So a lot of universities, especially the big research universities, have their own fellowships. You come in and want to work on something that's relevant to the institution, but you get to direct that. Really, you've got a lot of freedom for your own projects and what to do there. And how to guide it but again, usually you're not going to get it if it's not connected to what other people there are interested in working on. I put in parentheses fellowships that blend research and teaching. The 5 colleges up in Massachusetts used to have one of these. It looks like it's been defunct for a few years, and there was at least briefly a couple of others, and I didn't see any of those. So I don't know if there are currently any of those that explicitly exist right now. I didn't actually find any. There used to be, I think, probably if that's something you're interested in, you more have to look a little bit more carefully and find ones that aren't necessarily fellowships, but positions that you can use that way. And then the more traditional positions with individual researchers, right? Some researcher usually has some grant money on a specific project that they're hiring postdocs for. You come in to work on a very specific project, right? So there, it's not so much your choice of the work, although presumably you're bringing expertise and interest to that and can shape it to some degree, but you're really being brought in to work on a specific project. And then, as I said, the science policy ones. So sort of the range of these things. And I wanted to show this because this is, again, from that postdoc guide, because getting those decisions and then getting in there, really thinking about how if you use that time is important, right? And why picking is important. So that first year, you're really laying the groundwork for your professional career development. Again, this is why picking something that you think is going to help you in that career development is important. Exploration and identification of career path options, right? So you don't have to have it fully determined at that time, although the kind of thing that you pick may guide some of that. Developing skills and knowledge targeting that path, right? The postdoc is really very focused on getting you where you want to go at that next step. Exploring and enhancing your network is really critical because, again, as it always is, a grad student, that's something to think about as well, making those connections, because at each step, having them helps you get to the next one. Intermediate years, you're continuing to build that skill set, finding opportunities to enhance your skill set, right? Develop new skills, expand that network. This is where you get to, and sometimes that postdoc can be exploratory a little bit as well. So as I said, my first postdoc was sort of the more traditional position. I went to the University of Colorado at Boulder to work, and it got shifted a little bit what projects I was working on, but in particular, they were developing the cosmic origin spectrograph for Hubble. It dates me by quite a bit, right? And so a lot of it was about developing the science and doing the science that would be useful for some of the projects, because as the instrument team, they actually got some time on the instrument. And so we were trying to work towards that and understanding quasar absorption line systems around to look at the gas around galaxies. And that connected with work I'd done on gas in galaxies as a graduate student. So really kind of putting those two things together and using them to understand the evolution of galaxies was the goal of that work. From there, right, I developed some new skills because I had not done absorption line work before. I hadn't worked in the UV. It was very statistical. So it was really combining sort of the skills I'd built as a graduate student with these new techniques and ways to do things. Again, to make myself more competitive, to do some new stuff and to broaden the science that I could address given my interests. So that's really important as you think about this. How is it going to broaden you? But while still building on the things that you've become expert at as a graduate student. Because then you use it to sort of as a launch point for the next step. So for me, that was a couple of years in applying for the NSF Astronomy and Astrophysics Postdoctoral Fellowship. Really, I mean, what I planned to do, we'll talk a little bit about the fact that that wasn't what I ended up doing in the end, but was some ground-based observations that were going to help us understand some galaxies that we could do absorption line work with the cosmic origin spectrograph, which was supposed to launch sort of right at the beginning of my fellowship time. And so that would be great. We could combine the data and do both pieces. And I was, a lot of the work that I was going to be completely responsible for the ground-based piece, since the absorption line work was sort of the group I was working with. So I'd still have access to that and be involved, but I could be sort of leading the ground observations. That was all great. And also I will say the NSF Fellowship, unlike some of the others, has a piece of it which is on education and outreach. So the goal is to sort of talk about how you're going to be a leader in your field down the line, both in terms of the research, right? So, and also sort of education outreach. And people do really interesting, creative things on that education outreach side. I mean, I've now seen many, have lots of colleagues who've done it and some really cool projects. Mine was a variety of things, the first piece of which was on a middle school program at the University of Colorado. So I had gotten in touch with them, I'd worked with them. They had been developing materials for middle school teachers as part of this program, but they'd never had one that was sort of astronomy physics related. They had biology people, they had, I think, some chemistry. So they'd done a year after, and they did it sort of one topic each year. So we decided to do light, sort of a unit on light for the year I was there, and I would help design that. And what was really kind of fun about that was then we would go out, have these workshops where teachers would come with their students and try out the materials and get to know them. And then with those students, bring them back to the classroom. So that was one way we got to do that. And then I got involved in physics education research after I moved my fellowship. So that was the first bit. And I actually also worked with the learning assistant program at Colorado and got really interested in the fact that there were different ways to teach in the undergraduate classroom. And so people there were doing at that time what was brand new. Nobody had learning assistants before then. Carl Wyman was there with a bunch of, and Dick McRae was the one I was working with more directly, and we did some really neat stuff. So when the shuttle, when we lost the shuttle and all of the Hubble servicing was canceled, I was a little bit stuck because a lot of the work that I'd proposed to do as part of my project was not going to happen. It didn't happen for another 10 years. So it was really put on hold. And so at that time, I decided to move the fellowship. And this is one thing with some of these national ones that can be done when it's not institution-based. So I moved it to the Center for Astrophysics and worked with the Spitzer team there to look at infrared properties of galaxies and the star formation side of the gas stars process. And started working with a physics education research group at Harvard based on the work I'd done at Colorado, and got very involved in that. So this is where these kinds of things can take you, but it's really about building those skill sets and thinking about where you want to go and using that time really, really intentionally. So I put together, I won't go through these in detail. I was asked for amounts, and honestly, it turns out it's really hard right now. It's not as easy as I thought it would be to find sort of the nominal stipends, but a lot of these national postdocs, not only do they come with stipend, but they come with health benefits and some travel and things like that. The NSF one's $69K. I suspect the Hubble ones are comparable, but I don't know because it wasn't actually readily grabbable. For some of the others, it's, they say sort of commensurate with experience. So it will depend. These are usually kind of the top end of what that distribution is if you're just finishing grad school. So it gives you some sense of how much it is. And I'll leave these here. But as I said, these general runs, Hubble and NSF, really give you freedom to pick what you want to do and pick where you want to do it, and then justify why you want to be in that place. And this is something interesting to do. The NSF one is a little different in that it also has this education outreach component, which is really important. They do pay a lot of attention to that. And as I said, there's some really cool things that get done every year. Some really interesting and impressive stuff. The National Labs one, and all of these will be available. So you can click on the link and read more about them, again, or more specifically at these labs and places tying to obviously the kinds of work either NASA does or some of the other government labs will do. I believe I'm not as expert in the NRC. I think there are other people around who are and can tell you more about them, but you usually have to kind of find a sponsor for the NRC. So have someone who's working at one of those labs and is interested in your application. I don't know whether that. And I did want to mention the science policy ones, which are a totally different, ballgame in some sense. But it's also, if it's a path you're interested in beyond graduate school, it's a great opportunity. And I'll point out actually that I put on here the second one, the Jansky Fellowship, which is a shorter term thing. It's not a once you graduate type job. It's actually 12 weeks hands-on in DC, where you get to experience policy. So you can actually do this. It's for graduate students. So I think you can do this before you graduate. Right? So it's just a few months focused on that. I think most people do it over the summer and develop some of those skills and try some of these things out. So that's an option. The Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, you have to have gotten your degree. So it is a postdoc in that sense, but you can be at any stage of your career. And there's sort of there are two pieces, there are several pieces of it. One is the piece within the executive branch, which is a lot of the fellows, and you go to any of the various executive branch offices that have offerings at your NSF, NIH. I think FDA usually has some, EPA definitely does, State Department, so you can go work on science diplomacy kinds of things. There's a huge variety, but they also sponsor a small number of legislative fellowships, and then a lot of the professional societies sponsor their own legislative fellowships, and those all kind of work together, and they also sit, as some of the orientation is common across all of these. And in that case, you go either you work on the Hill, either for one of the committees within House or Senate, or really mostly I think there's Senate committees, or in the office of a representative. So either one of the House or Senate representatives. And there's a whole process for how you end up in a specific office, but then you become sort of the scientist in general, with the exception of a handful of Senate offices where they have a few, but expert across all sorts of things, which means knowing not just about space policy and various other things, but they, you know, from the colleagues I have who've done that, they throw, you know, environmental policy, they'll throw whatever they have that has science related stuff in it, probably in your direction, especially in the House offices, and probably things that have nothing to do with science as well, because that's how a lot of those offices operate. There aren't a lot of people, and it's about figuring out all sorts of stuff. Very different world, and interesting for that, right? So it's a way to see something that's very different. And most of the fellows, I would say, are either just out of grad school. I mean, maybe they did a postdoc and decided they didn't want to take an academic path. I would say the vast majority are considering staying in policy type things as a path. Not all. I mean, one of our faculty at Mason did the fellowship and is now a professor in environmental science and policy here. So it's not always the case, but mostly it's sort of people go that direction as a longer term. I would say with the exception of those of us who go later in our careers and always intend to, you know, sort of intend to probably come back. The people who are doing it on leave from a university are the ones who tend not to stay. But again, so this is a very different, oh, and I should also say there are a handful in the judicial branch, but that's a small number, although they've been trying to grow it over the last few years. And as I said, so the last one was just at individual institutions, right? There are lots that have this research emphasis and work with individual researchers, but I already kind of mentioned that. So I will stop there. That's sort of the vast overview of the world of fellowships and postdocs and things you can do. And hopefully time for questions, discussion. Anything else you want to know?
I had a question. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, you just posted the link again. So if people want to ask questions,
yeah, because I think if you join after I send it into the chat, it kind of like doesn't exist for them.
That's right.
So yeah, feel free to unmute and ask questions or submit something to the anonymous question form. But in the meantime, I had a question on like the length of the appointments. Because at least like for PhD, like we know it's around 5 to 6 years, and it depends for everyone. Is there kind of like a range for postdoc fellowships, or does it just really depend on what you end up getting?
It does, you know, it depends a little bit, right? So I think in astronomy, it's pretty common for it to be 3 years, which is longer, I think, than in a lot. But that said, I mean, almost always it's as you get to these individual ones, and I mean, really all of them are 1 year renewable, right? Sometimes it's more restrictive on the individual, you know, working for an individual, because it'll be dictated by how long they have that funding for. So if they know they have several years of fund, and I think people tend to want to do multiple years, at least 2. So 1 is incredibly short, right? You're applying for jobs as soon as you show up if you have a 1 year position, which is not optimal for really doing any of the things that we mentioned about building careers and really that direction. So that's certainly something to consider. The Hubble and NSF are all 3 years. The policy, AAAS is also renewable, but it's 2. You can do it for 2 years. So again, they vary, but usually 2 or 3, I think, is pretty common. I have occasionally seen longer ones, but that's sort of, you know, and I've certainly seen 1 year, but that's painfully short. And if you're really transitioning it's one thing if it's very closely aligned to stuff you've been doing, so you can just jump right in and continue working and not have to learn something very new to get up to speed. But otherwise, I think that's a really hard position to be in.
I'm not sure if you already mentioned this during the presentation, but how important are postdocs in regards to trying to find a job in the field that you want to take
for an academic, so for a research focused academic position, they're very important. You know, I can't think of any case that I know of for which somebody got into an academic research kind of, you know, faculty position without a postdoc. Teaching, you know, the more teaching oriented schools that are, you know, especially these primarily undergraduate institutions, it's more of a mix, right? Some people do go in straight out of graduate school. I think many, though, at this point still do a postdoc first, but that's more of a mix, I would say. And some people who are interested in that path, what I've seen is often some of these smaller institutions will look for visiting faculty to come, like somebody's on sabbatical, right? They need a replacement for a year. And so they hire people. And I know people who've gone that route who have done that. And it's been very helpful for them because then you get to work in that environment for a year, get some expertise, and then apply for jobs. The postdoc, I mean, I applied for a lot of positions actually at smaller schools, and having done a postdoc, but also, and being able to speak to the kinds of research I would do with undergraduates was really valuable. But you have to be able to bill your research as something you could and would do with undergraduate students in that kind of position. So yeah, it depends. But for the standard research-oriented faculty position, yes, postdocs are pretty critical.
So I know that, like, obviously there's different types of fellowships, but do they all have a similar like application process? Is it kind of like the GRFP, I guess? That's the only like application that has research stuff I'm familiar with.
Most of them are fairly similar, right? It's talking about the research you've done and the research you want to do. The NSF fellowship is a little bit different because you also have to talk about the education outreach that you want to do. There's actually, and they'll say this, looks a lot more like an NSF career award, which is one of the big research and sort of education awards grants once you're faculty in structure, right? So that one's a little bit more grant oriented, and you have to talk about that education outreach piece and have a substantial part of your application on that. But generally, I think when you apply to work in someone's lab, you have to talk a little bit more about why that project, so it's specific, as opposed to the more general, here's what I want to do, here's the proposal for what that research looks like. And then obviously something like the AAAS Fellowship for Science and Technology Policy is totally different because it's a completely different beast and they're looking for very different kinds of things.
Jessica, may I add? Joe Pesh here.
Yeah.
Great talk and great summary and great review of all things available. I'd be remiss if I didn't add, I don't think you said this, the Jansky Fellowship out of the NRAO.
No, absolutely. I should know better, right? And well, really what I should point out, right, is at some level that fits in. I mean, there's Jansky, and one of the things that I did mean to say in terms of the institutions, there are also, and I was remiss in this, and it was on my list to mention, a lot of the telescopes, right, have their own, like, I mean, Carnegie Observatories has them, some of the other observatories have observatory fellowships, and then Jansky is the NRAO part of that. Absolutely, which gives you, again, the ability to do your work at an institution. So there are a variety of those kinds of things.
And I've just put the link in the chat.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Justin.
Radio person, I should not miss that one. So I appreciate that.
Do you know if there are any postdocs that are like exclusive, like the only focus is on teaching, so you can kind of like hone your skills there and try out new stuff to be prepared to like apply for a faculty position, for example?
Not that I know of. As I said, these 5 college ones used to be a mix with a lot of focus on sort of the undergraduate teaching environment, but you do a little bit of research usually with undergraduates. So the idea was to build that part of it. And as I said, that one seems to not exist anymore, and I have to poke around a little. But I think what people often do are these visiting positions. So you kind of get that in a different form, slightly different format. At least that's what I've seen with colleagues who've done that kind of thing.
Yes, it's still going. It's not Yes, it's terrible. Did you clean up your mess out there? What? No, I meant in the kitchen. Yeah. Go clean it up, okay?
Any recommendations on how soon we should be applying to postdocs?
So in general, you can't start one until you're done, right? And so there's a general cycle in that you apply, they start coming out now. I think the deadline, and look at when these deadlines are, but they're usually winter-ish, I think. So do you know when NSF is? I mean, I think that's a fairly typical sort of start, right? They start earlier and maybe even late fall for a lot of them. Did you know, Joe?
The deadline for the APF, I'm looking it up at the moment. It's passed. I think it was last month.
Oh, so it's earlier then. Okay, so I'm a little bit behind.
Because we review at the beginning of January.
Okay, that makes sense.
Might be coming up.
That's coming up.
Right, I'll take a look.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So and those are usually sort of the leading edge of the process, right? So the earliest ones are the sort of these national fellowships, and then kind of the observatory prize fellowships at institutions, those sorts of things. So I guess they're earlier fall. I was thinking they were late fall, but so, they start at the beginning of the fall and they're for the following fall, right? So you're applying a year ahead for what you want to do. But then for individual ones, I mean, they can come out as late any time of the year, really. It depends on when people know they have funding or not. I think people try to get it sort of in that late fall, early springtime so that they can hire for fall, because most academics end up on that cycle with some exceptions.
And AAPF at NSF is October 15th is the end of the window. It opens on the 15th of August.
Okay, yeah, so great. So it just passed, right? We're past October 15th, right? I have no idea what day it is anymore. But yeah, you have to start thinking about this probably a little over a year ahead of when you think you're going to finish and graduate. And then it becomes sort of this issue because you can't start till you're done, right? So if you get it, then there's this sort of juggle of making sure. And I remember doing this even for mine, which was just an individual one. I had to get all the paperwork through because I had to have the sort of stamp of approval from the university, even though they wouldn't issue the degree until their degree dates, which since I finished in summer, I mean, I think it wasn't until the next spring. They might have done it in winter, but whatever it was not, I was starting my job before then, but they had to sort of issue the paperwork saying you're finished, other than the fact that we haven't handed you the degree yet. So there are some things that happen that way, but in general, as long as you've defended and everybody signed off, you're good to go.
Is there an expectation on like how much you're supposed to publish when you're in a postdoc? Or is it just more focused on like what you were saying about building the skills that you need to get to where you want to be after your postdoc?
Well, if you're looking at an academic career, some of that is publishing, right? Because you're going to get that job, at least in part, based on having published significantly. So yes, absolutely, it's an important part if a sort of research academic career is what you're interested in. So that's part of building those skills and producing the results of it. And I should have made that clear, because that is really, really important in that time window, is to be publishing.
I know this is a dumb question and I'm sorry in advance, but do you still have like kind of an advisor or someone that you report to even though you're in a postdoc? Like I'm assuming that you might be overseeing some undergrads in that position, but like how does that hierarchy work?
That's not a dumb question at all. And it's a very good question. And a little bit, it depends. So there's always somebody you report to, even for the prize fellowships, right? I mean, and in some sense, like for the NSF one, some level you're reporting back to them, but you still have a university person or an observatory person or whatever it is at your institution who's kind of responsible. It has to sign up, say, yes, we're going to make sure that they've got an office, they've got a computer, that we're going to sort of make sure things are happening as they should. But for the specific ones, it's even more, it's a much tighter connection than that. They've got a grant, they're looking for it to get done, and the reporting and requirements are much, much more stringent. And it depends a little bit on the person. Usually in most of those positions, and I'm certainly not all, they'll give you some fraction of your time for your own stuff, which is something worth looking for, because I think that's important at that point in time to be able to at least explore some things on your own. And that varies depending position to position. But in all of them, there's somebody you're reporting back to. But I think the big difference between the fellowships and sort of the working for an individual is the level of freedom. What those fellowships really give you is a freedom to kind of do the things you want to do and drive your own agenda in that time. Whereas working for somebody on their grant is much more directed at what they want you to do in that time. But then it's even more important to think about where you want to go and finding the space and time to do all the things that you feel like you need and want to do to get there, in addition to making sure you get the things that you have to do done. And I will say that's also one of the weird things about the policy fellowship that I found, having been some level my own boss for many, many years, going there and, having to report to people on what I do. It was much more I had much more of a boss in that position than I've had in others, which was definitely different in that way. Anything else?
I guess another question I might have is, which I'm pretty sure there isn't, but I thought I'd ask anyway, is are there like fees for application as well?
No, there should be no fees for application for postdocs. just your time, which which it will be a lot of. It does take a lot of time putting these together, because there's even more to tweak from one to the next, I think, than probably for grad school admissions.
For the fellowships that have like a teaching component, are you expected to have, I guess, like a draft of like your teaching statement or kind of like your own philosophy, or is that like you're expected not to do that in the application?
Well, as I said, I mean, these don't, not so many of these exist as I've seen them in current times, and I'm not sure what the format of the 5 college one was. I'm sure they asked you to talk about teaching and how it relates to your teaching experience when they did it. I don't know exactly what that looked like because I couldn't pull it up. But there it's really about building yourself as a teacher, especially in that primarily undergraduate institution environment. And if you apply to be a visiting instructor, they will definitely ask for that. And again, those are generally teaching-oriented institutions. So they're really thinking about how much are you thinking about teaching, and so your teaching statement is going to be important. And since that's something that everyone has to put together, ultimately, if you're going to apply for faculty jobs, it's not a bad thing to start thinking about.
It doesn't look like we have any questions on the online form, so we can probably end a little early if no one else has any questions.
Final call.
Okay, so I guess thank you so much for talking about this. I really appreciated it, and we will see everyone next week.
Great,
to learn
thanks,
about
guys.
mentorship.
Thank you again.
Thank